Wahrscheinlich. Also, Ladies and Gentlemen, willkommen bei der Buchpräsentation von Dani Gal. Mein Name ist Eva Kovac, ich bin die wissenschaftliche Leiterin des Instituts und es ist mir eine große Freude und Ehre, die Veranstaltung zu eröffnen. Jetzt werde ich weiter auf Englisch reden, weil die Diskussion auf Englisch stattfinden wird, aber danach können Sie natürlich die Fragen auf Deutsch auch stellen, also dann werden wir sofort bilingual. Also, so this is really an honor for me to introduce Dani Gal. Dani Gal is in 1975 in Jerusalem geboren. Wieder auf Deutsch, sorry. And lives and works in Berlin. He studied in the Bezalel Academy for Art and Design in Jerusalem and die Staatliche Hochschule für Bildende Künste in Frankfurt und die Cooper Union in New York. His films and works have been shown at the Centre Pompidou in Paris in 2018, the Documenta 14 in 2017, at Kunsthalle Vienna in 2015, Kunsthaus in Zürich in 2015, in the Berlinale Forum expanded in 2014, the Jewish Museum in New York 2014, etc., etc. So in many places. His films and works have been shown widely in other film festivals and cultural events. Dani was here in Vienna as artist in residence in 2019 at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies and with the project 3 Works for Piano. During the artist in residence in Vienna, hosted by Blood Mountain Project and the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, funded by the Federal Chancellery of the Republic of Austria, and scheduled to take place between August and October 2019, Dani revised events from the 20th century musical avant-garde to elaborate on his examination on the complexities of transgenerational trauma and its effects on the relationships between perpetrators and victims of nationalist oppression. And I remember Dani when we discussed many scholarly articles with a big enthusiasm, and this is really a wonderful memory for the Institute. I would like to continue with Sabet Buchmann. Welcome, Sabet, here in the Bookshop Bookshop Singer. Sabet is art historian and critic in Berlin and in Vienna. She's also professor of the history of modern and postmodern art at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. Her specialization is in modern and postmodern art history, with particular interest in the history of post-conceptual art, both in Europe, North and South America, and in other international aspects of post-war arts, especially with focus on human, machine, and cybernetic discourses, and their impact on early post-war and post-war art practices. Research is on procedures of rehearsal and learning exercise in the visual arts, as well as on the history and practice of art, film, and cultural criticism. In springtime 2017, she took as a guest professorship at the University of Zurich, Department for Art History, and from January and March to March 2016, she was guest lecturer at the UCLA, and since 2018, she is a board member and guest lecturer as Escola das Artes in the Universidade Católica Portuguesa, Porto. Since 1998, she is a board member of the art program, of the art magazine Text und Kunst. Regular contribution for magazines, reader, and monographs, as well as for art and exhibitions catalogs, is also her profile. Her latest books are Die Stimme als Voice and Vote, Verschrift für Diederischen, and Sabat was co-editor this volume, and another book was published also in 2019. The title is Putting Rehearsals in the Test, Practices and Rehearsal in Fine Art, Film, Theater, and Theory, and Politics. Our next guest is Hanno Löwy. Everybody knows him as well. Hanno was born in 1961 in Frankfurt am Main. And he is a German literary and media scholar, journalist, and director of the Jewish Museum Hohenems. Hanno Löwy studied literary studies, theater, film, and television studies, as well as cultural anthropology in Frankfurt am Main, and was awarded a dissertation at the University of Constance with a dissertation on the film theorist Béla Balázs, which is very important as a Hungarian, and the history of ideas in film in the context of the aesthetics, philosophical, and political utopias of the early 20th century. He has been working as a publicist and exhibition organizer since 1982. Amazing, since 40 years. Okay, we will not count it. He worked on parts of the permanent exhibition for the Jewish Museum Frankfurt am Main and the Jewish Museum Berlin. And from 1990 to 2000, he set up the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt am Main. From 1990 to 1995 as founding director. And after joining the University of Frankfurt am Main, was head of the Department for Culture and Remembrance and Reception Research in the same building until 2003. Since 2000, Hanno Löwy has been a lecturer at the University of Constance in the in the field of literary studies and media studies. Since 2004, he has headed the Jewish Museum Hohenems in the Austrian state of Rothberg. Since 2011, he has been president of the Association of European Jewish Museums. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Alexander F. Fanon, who will help us to make this book presentation as lively as possible. He studied history and sociology, so all of us really have a very interesting life history, I have to say. So he studied history and sociology at the University of Vienna, where he received his PhD in 1993. And until 2015, he also worked as a freelance social and cultural scientist. From 2008, he received acting training, such as improvisation with Thomas Seywald, bodywork with Christian Suchi and Norman Taylor, camera acting with Jerry Cole, method acting with Robert Castle, and Meissner techniques von Steven Dittmeier. From 2009 to 2012, he was at the Schubert Theater in the title role of Erling, and the Lechner Eddie schaut ins Paradies, in Astoria and in Der grüne Kakadu, and das Herr von Lips in der Zerrissene. Since 2012, he has been involved in the productions of Drama Baby, in the Drachengasse Theater, and in many other theater performances in Vienna. Alexander F. Fanon is the founding member of the Picaboo Improvisation Theater. Currently, you could meet him in the ORF series, for example, in Walking on Sunshine, or in the documentary Rothschild, Aufstieg, Glanz und Verfolgung. So we have a really dedicated group of guests. Thank you very much for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you.
Sitting. Yes, so
thank you. We will do this discussion in English. So thank you, Evan. Thank you for the Institute to invite me. And thank you to Black Mountain Project and Jade Nikolai to organize, facilitate the whole thing, and also initiating this book. So I'll talk a little bit about the book and about the trilogy of films. Briefly, I'll show a few clips from them, and then we can start an open discussion between us, and then open it up. In 2011, I shot the first film in this trilogy called A Night and Fog, where I took the title back from the German Romanticism literature through Alain René's take on the Nazi night and the same name into my own name, which is a reenactment of the night between 31st of May and 1st of June 1962, where a group of Israeli policemen took the ashes of Adolf Eichmann after his execution to outside the territorial waters of Israel. The film, in a way, that doesn't have dialogues. It has a voiceover based on a long interview I made with Michael Goldman, who is the protagonist of the film. I'll show a short clip from it. And this is the moment where they are boarding the boat. I don't know if you can turn the light a bit down.
At the end of the trial, I was chosen to be one of the 2 witnesses to the execution. I went home, put on my uniform, and drove to the prison. While walking along the prison walls, I thought, this is like Auschwitz. Only this time, it is his Auschwitz.
This sentence that This last sentence that Michael Goldman told me in the interview, that he had this memory from Auschwitz where he spent time when he was about 16 years old, but saying this is his, meaning Eichmann's Auschwitz, was maybe the very first idea of this moment where this clear boundaries, this clear binary between a victim and perpetrator is in a way kind of destabilized, which led me slowly to the next 2 films that are dealing with these moments, encounters between people where this kind of what Primo Levi called the gray zone, not exactly exercised, but in a way kind of it can be a useful concept. We will read later the short paragraph from Primo Levi about it. So the next film was As From Afar, which is a fictionalized account meeting between Simon Wiesenthal and Albert Speer in the 70s, but it is based on, the dialogues are based on the letters that are here in the archive that the 2 exchanged during the 70s, where they became personal friends and had also personal meetings. The film depicts a personal meeting between the two, supposedly in Vienna, somewhere in the 70s. I'll show a short clip from it. Sorry. Wrong one.
Oft sah ich auf der täglichen Fahrt in mein Architekturbüro von der Aarhus in weiter Ferne Menschenmassen am Bahnhof Nikolassee. Ich wusste, dass es sich um die Evakuierung der Berliner Juden handelte. Sehr wahrscheinlich hatte ich eine Ahnung dunkler Vorgänge.
Now, should I say that hearing this tune, played with this expression, is in itself that particular experience of pastness? Or should I say that hearing the tune causes the feeling of pastness to arise, and that this feeling accompanies the tune? Or can I separate an experience of pastness expressed by a gesture from the experience of making this gesture?
I want just quickly, when I talked about Night and Fog, I'll walk through a few very important objects, and later what Sabet will talk maybe a little bit about what you call like Denkbilder, or an object that holds, and images that holds many meanings and many references. So also based on the interview with Goldman, the ashes of Adolf Eichmann were carried in a milk jug, which of course, among other references, can be referred to Ringelblum archive, where Jewish people in Warsaw Ghetto hid documents in milk jugs and buried them in the ground. In this film, this very facade, I'll show it in a photo. Is a fake facade that is built after the Hotel zur Oper, that is the main location in the film The Night Porter, Nachtportier, that was filmed here in the 70s too, and where the film touches the complicated relationship on a sadomasochistic level between a Holocaust survivor from Mauthausen and an SS officer who meet later in Vienna. I wanted to refer to this film where Wiesenthal and Speer also, in a way, on a psychological level, have some kind of like a sadomasochistic exchange of attraction and suspicion toward each other, and also have a mutual past relating to Mauthausen, since Wiesenthal was a prisoner there, and allegedly Speer was the one who initiated the camp. Another scene, quick short scene from As From Afar, more at the beginning, is how the film starts in the visit to the Cook, the model builder.
Da hinten, bei den Treppen zu den Steinbrüchen. Jeden Tag mussten wir über die Leichen der Männer steigen, die den Weg darauf nicht geschafft haben. Aber das Gleis völlig genau. Da war kein Gleis, nicht wahr?
Ich habe das für eine große Filmproduktion gebaut. Amerikaner. Die wollen Gleise. Sie sagen, sonst sieht es nicht aus wie ein KZ.
Woher hatten Sie die Pläne für das Lager?
Pläne? Na, Pläne hatte ich nicht. Ich habe das aus meiner Erinnerung nachgebaut.
Weißt du, ich habe einmal einen Entwurf für das Holocaust-Denkmal in Jerusalem angefertigt. Mit der Fassade von Mauthausen. Wie bei deinem Modell waren meine Türme auch viel höher als im echten Lager.
Wir haben früher auch solche schönen Modelle gebaut. Einmal sogar, wenn ich mich richtig erinnere, für Göring, eins im Maßstab 1:1. Und als ich Hitler die Pläne für sein größenwahnsinniges Vorhaben Germania vorgelegt habe, habe ich Scheinwerfer benutzt wie die. Ich glaube, ich habe sie bei der UFA geliehen. Unser größenwahnsinniges Vorhaben natürlich.
The last film in the trilogy is White City. Again, another encounter between two people who are supposedly or historically supposed to stand on both opposite sides. And again, based on the entry, the film is revolved around the story of Arthur Rupin, who was a German Jew and one of the founders of the Zionist settlement. And he was also a eugenist who wrote, a sociologist who wrote eugenic books about eugenics, mainly about the Jewish race. And he wrote an entry in his diary that in August 1933 he went to meet Hans F.K. Gunther, who was the main researcher of the Aryan race and was embraced by the Nazi Party. So the main scene in the film is the meeting between the two. In a way, the frame for the film happens in Stuttgart in Weisenhof estate, which was an example for the new modern architecture, was built in 1927, and there's a story about a postcard that was an advertisement for this neighborhood that was later taken by the Nazis, who photomontaged Arab figures, Bedouin figures, and camels on it to claim that this kind of architecture belongs to the Levant and therefore primitive. So these are the two main features of the film that we can unpack later. I'll play a short clip.
Werden diese Gebäude verlottert und verlassen dastehen? Ja. Sagen Sie mir doch noch eines. Ich habe gelesen, dass das Weltjudentum seit der Wahl der NSDAP einen Boykott gegen Deutschland ausrufen möchte.
Ich halte nichts von Aktionen dieser Art, Professor Günther. Die praktischen Zionisten sind immer für positive Aktionen gewesen. Daher habe ich mich schon im März gegen den Boykott ausgesprochen. Außerdem wird bereits an einem Vertrag über die Bedingungen der Umsiedlung gearbeitet.
Ich wünsche Ihnen eine gute Reise.
Wenn wir nur eine überzeugende Lösung für die Araberfrage hätten. Gewiss. Am Anfang hätte man die Araber anders bedenken müssen. Ihnen die Hebung der gesamten Kultur durch unsere Einwanderung schmackhaft machen. Bis 29 hätte man noch an ein friedliches Zusammenleben denken können. Doch nach dem Massaker in Hebron kann davon keine Rede mehr sein. Jetzt ist alles verfahren. Was wir von den Arabern bekommen können, können wir nicht brauchen. Und das, was wir brauchen, können wir nicht bekommen. Es führt keinen Weg zurück. Land für die Verlachen muss verhandelt werden. Die brachliegenden Landstriche um Homs, die zum Verkauf stehen, bieten sich geradezu an für eine schrittweise, aber zügige Umsiedlung.
Sorry, can you see that? So these are the postcards that I mentioned. That the film actually ends in the same shot. The film begins with close-up on Rupin's hand, who is choosing between the two postcards. The upper one is the original one, and the lower one is the doctored one, the one that is photomontaged. Now, the book is trying to put an image here for. Take a lot of the complex issues of the films, of my films, but I think that the book tries to go beyond my films to unpack those complex issues of cultural memory, this multidirectional memory, victim-perpetrator relationship, and this complicated triangle between German, Jewish, Palestinian histories. And there are 4 texts in the book, 3 essays and 1 long conversation between Sabet and me. The other, just briefly about the other texts, one text by the art historian Buchpräsentation, who writes about migration of history and society as a call to examine fixed notion of history, and formulates the thesis that history is a net full of holes, consisting primarily of the unwritten and the undescribed. A small quote from her essay: "It is precisely the cinematic fictionalization that produces the visible and the material that challenges the order of tradition. What is this history, and not the widely accepted one? Where is the basis of our knowledge? Isn't history always made, and who or what decide what is worth remembering?" The art historian Noit Banai writes in her essay Hallucinatory Cinema and the Dialogical Politics of Framing, in Gal's film, in films that reenact events whose potency continues to shape our collective imagery, Gal has developed a hallucinatory cinema that raises questions about its own role as an instrument for the production and reproduction of the effect and affect of the real, transform the complex zones of indeterminacy between fact and fiction into an unsettling corporal and visual experience. The closing essay of the book, written by Syed Achan, who is a PhD for peace and conflict studies, and he's in a way outsider to the arts. And he wrote an essay called mainly about White City that is called Spectre of the Palestinians. He wrote, I confront the issues not just as a scholar and anthropologist, but also as a Palestinian. His essay is a bit more personal, but nevertheless has a political tone. And he writes, even though the Nakba has not yet occurred when the film takes place, it is always present for Gal, even when seemingly absent. As with the ghost that haunts society and entire nations, we cannot always see what nonetheless clearly surrounds us. In this case, it is the specter of the Palestinian subject that we cannot escape. And of course, the conversation between Sabet and I that deals with ethical, moral, historical, and aesthetic dilemmas, multidirectional memory, unsettling empathy, cinematic point of views, and the possibility or impossibility of images in relation to representation of the Holocaust. Lastly, also thank you to Michael Rothberg, who kindly wrote at the back, the brief at the back of the book, who is, a lot of his concepts are in a way centered to the book and the films. Yes. So maybe we'll start with, throughout the book, I chose different short text paragraphs from literature and theory, history that accompanied me throughout these 10 years of making those films. And we chose a few of those quotes that maybe will help us for the conversation, and Alexander will read them.
The first quote is by Primo Levi, The Drowned and the Saved, 1986. The ascent of the privileged, not only in the lager, but in all human coexistence, is an anguishing but unfailing phenomenon. Only in utopias it is absent.
Thank you.
Where power is exercised by a few or only one against the many, privilege is born and proliferates, even against the will of the power itself. On the other hand, it is normal for power to tolerate and encourage privilege. Let us confine ourselves to the lager, which, even in its Soviet version, can be considered an excellent, quote, laboratory. The hybrid class of the prisoner functionary constitutes its armature and at the same time its most disquieting feature. It is a gray zone, poorly defined, where the two camps of masters and servants both diverge and converge. This gray zone possesses an incredibly complicated internal structure and contains within itself enough to confuse our need to judge.
I'm done.
Shall I
Yes,
continue?
please.
And when we are talking about a trilogy, so
of 3 films. So the first thing I would like to do is try to attempt on a kind of structure of a thematic space these 3 films explore. And I would try to discuss the film showing Wiesenthal and Speer visiting Cook, the model maker, who was also a prisoner in Auschwitz, in Mauthausen, as a piece about the construction of memory, while the piece about the drowning the ashes of Eichmann into the Mediterranean is about the backside of a national public staging of memory, the trial. But it shows not the trial, it shows what is on the back of the trial, hidden in the night. And the third film is about multidirectional memory versus kind of identitarian memory, a memory that constructs who is belonging and who is not, who takes part and who takes not part. And starting with the construction of memory, the first time I ran into your work was in a show in St. Gallen, which is, to our fortune, close to Hohenems in Switzerland. So I was lucky enough to see the show. And what struck me, and seeing the film, A Scene from Afar, Scene from Afar, was that it was presented together with a model.
Yes.
And the model showed the tracks, and we all connect the tracks to the trains, taking those deemed for being killed into the camp. But it also showed the track with a camera on the track that referred to a completely different scene, which is the scene of doing a film about the Holocaust, which you put this image here of the tracking shot that Alain René did in Auschwitz, using tracks, other tracks, for shooting the film. And there was a big debate in the early 60s about the film Capo by Gilles Pontecorvo, who also used tracking shots. And I think it was Jacques Rivette who heavily opposed this aesthetics brought to this scene to do a show about the camp.
Why was the opposing?
He found it absolutely obscene to use these aesthetics of cinema to portray, in a way, similar a bit to the argument of Lanzmann, to make a show out of the destruction. So there was a big debate, but so it has a lot of layers and a lot of ambivalence, showing these tracks as part of the destruction, but also part of the staging, the construction and the staging of the destruction in the camp.
Yes.
So that struck me from the very first moment, from what you did in your films and in the maquettes, the models you created, that it was creating a very ambiguous image in which the staging of memory and the memory itself is getting in conflict with each other.
Yeah.
As it happens with Wiesenthal and Speer and Cook in the film studio where they meet, and then they walk in the film studio, and all of a sudden
it was shot in Bavaria film studios, which is a facade, just a facade. It looks like a German street, or like Munich.
Yeah.
So,
and they walk through that film studio, and they come across that hotel facade from Vienna, which refers again to a film that was part of a whole lot of films that were produced in the 1960s and then in the 1970s, who were not just about the suffering and the destruction and the heroic battle for liberation, like Capo is presenting the prisoners as heroes and martyrs.
Oktober made the Battle of Algiers later, which is
already, so there was already a discourse about colonialism and the Nazis already in Alain René's film. But in the 1960s, the image of the survivors in the Holocaust movies changed from just people who were suffering or were martyrs or heroes into some kind of very puzzling ghosts from the past who were fantasized by the public. And we talk about fantasies expressed in TV series and films that were disturbingly presenting the past as something that is still alive. And that was the time of the trials as well. So the survivors met the perpetrators physically in the courtroom. And people like Wiesenthal looked for some perpetrators to discuss things and to understand why they did that. And Speer became a very crazy figure of fantasies in this time as an outspoken, as the illusion of a perpetrator who is sorry, feels sorry for what he did, which also was a facade. I mean, Speer was presenting himself definitely in a way he thought it would be favorable for him. And Wiesenthal and also other people, survivors and also scholars of the Holocaust, somehow fell into that trap. So this is another layer. And then you had the films of the 70s like Cavani, Night Porter, where the subject is really the fantasy of a sadomasochistic relationship between perpetrators and victims. And she was that was a serious film in a way about it. There were other films at that same time that were not serious at all. It was simply porno films about sadomasochistic relationship between Nazis and victims. And from all these films, from René up to Cavani, you can learn a lot about how people construct their memory, their fitting memory of the Holocaust, fitting to what they think is a political correct perception or a concept of the past that fits their beliefs.
And later we talked about the back to the model and the camera in front of the gates, and how as from afar starts is a point of view entering the concentration camp, which became a very iconic, also through Lanzmann and through other American cinema too, the point of view of entering the gates of the camps. And I realized that it's again a cinematic construction because no one really saw this kind of, had the chance to view the entries from this point of view. The victims were trapped inside cattle carts, they couldn't see outside. And Lanzmann interviews the train driver of Treblinka, and this became the famous poster of the film. If you remember, there's a Polish man standing away from the train, and he says that he was not pulling the train but pushing it. So again, even the driver didn't have this particular point of view. So it's in a way a cinematic construction that tells us this is the view of the victim. This is we should identify with it.
I mean, crazy enough, even René, who did a strictly documentary film in a way, mostly based on, for instance, tracking shots of Auschwitz in 1955, showing actually the museum of Auschwitz as a document. Even he did not refrain from fiction, because there is a famous scene in René showing a train entering the Auschwitz camp. But this is from a feature film by Wanda Jakubowska, done in 1948. So he used a staged fiction film to show something which was never documented.
And also his move between color and black and white is making, just kind of creating this question.
Yeah.
I think what you just said, the image of the tracks, and that it was impossible for the victims on the one hand and for the one who speaks with Landsmann, that they could see the tracks, that evokes the question whether it is the perpetrator's perspective. Then who was it who could see the tracks? And I think that is something significant for your film, that you let us, the viewers of your film, imagine the position of the perpetrator, and that is, as Godard once put it, the impossible perspective. And Godard was just saying in a very provocative way that the only valid representation of the Nazi terror, of the Holocaust, would be if we could also become aware of the perpetrator's perspective. And for me, it was really a provocative moment in Night and Fog when I realized
this image,
this image, because for preparation of our discussion, I read a couple of essays, and there was a very great one called Photographer in the Gas Chamber, saying that, or referring to the photographs that is subject of Didi Übermung's book, Bilder trotz alledem. I don't know the English translation. And he says that those perspectives represented in the photographs are the perspectives of the perpetrators. And I thought there is a kind of resonance in your films, not representing it in a kind of mimetic or analog sense, but let us imagine that perspective. And that brings in what Hanno already mentioned as a multidirectional memory, or I would first of all say it is a multidirectional perspective.
Yes, this is the first image of the film Night and Fog, and it does look like it is shot from the watchtower, meaning the point of view of the perpetrator. And I wanted to establish the first establishing shot of the film to create something, and also you're talking about this genre of like Holocaust films, 60s, 70s, a film that immediately people will think, oh, okay, it's a Holocaust thing. It's a Holocaust film. There's a barbed wire. There's this kind of night, and there's these soldiers. But a second after that, this image destabilizes when one understands. Well, these are not the fitting uniform, and the voiceover comes in, and you understand that this scene takes place in Israel, in a prison in the 60s, and it's the story of Eichmann. So there is this kind of destabilization here. It is done.
But just one note, maybe, about the gas chamber. It was always a heavy topic among filmmakers, yes or no, to enter the gas chamber in a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, the first one who planned to do that, and we don't know if he did it, was no other than Jerry Lewis,
mm-hmm.
who did a film that was never coming into the cinemas, The Clown That Cried, in which a clown is just by accident getting into, he's arrested because he made a joke about Hitler, but he is just by accident coming into the Jewish part of a camp, because that clown is not Jewish. Mm-hmm. And in the end, he entertains Jewish children that are sent to the gas chamber. Mm-hmm. And there are two versions of the book. One is going with him and the children into the gas chamber. So definitely taking a victim's perspective, and the other version shows him from the outside going into the gas chamber. And the film was never shown in any cinema, and we still don't know where it is.
So Beautiful Life is not an original idea, it's kind of almost a remake.
It's a bit of a remake. I mean, he did a lot of... Benigni did a lot of allusions to other films in his film, and he definitely knew that Jerry Lewis made that film that was never finished, because that was a legend in the film world, that Jerry Lewis did that. I mean, nobody would think of Jerry Lewis doing a film about Auschwitz.
Right.
Pretty early.
So maybe a quote about multidirectional memory, because you've been talking about this concept. It's from Michael Rothberg, Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization. The category of multidirectional memory allows us to begin to approach the simultaneously political and psychic nature of the excess in such discourses, because it insists that we take seriously the cross-cutting nature of public memories. While memory wars, such as those that continue to roil the Middle East, can provoke despair at the reduction of politics to crude stereotypes and name-calling, the uncomfortable proximity of memories is also the cauldron out of which new visions of solidarity and justice must emerge. I draw two corollaries from the kinds of memory conflicts emblematized by the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. First, we cannot stem the structural multidirectionality of memory. Even if it were desirable, as it sometimes seems to be, to maintain a wall or cordon sanitaire between different histories, it is not possible to do so. Memories are mobile. Histories are implicated in each other. Thus, finally, understanding political conflict entails understanding the interlacing of memories in the force field of public space. The only way forward is through their entanglement.
Thank you. Directly from this text, I would like to continue. On Night and Fog, this image shows one of the last shots in the film, and you mentioned the background of the trial, and in a way it's suggesting a kind of a disposal, like they disposing the ashes in the backyard, going beyond the territorial waters, which is an imaginary line, kind of, but still in a way the most abstract feature, one of the most abstract features of national borders. When I interviewed Goldman, he told me that when they came back to the shore, to Jaffa, they saw the fishermen, the Palestinian fishermen in Jaffa going out to sea. So I created this shot where the Palestinian, when you can see it here, where the Palestinian fishermen are going out and they see a police ship crossing, and they're both kind of looking at each other in a kind of a suspicion. In a way suggesting what are you doing in the sea, and in a way suggesting even more, after we know what they did, it is like this, you know, you are disposing this kind of European baggage in our sea, in a way, and they're going to fish. So yeah, this is in a way the moment in the first film which starts to touch this other side of this problem, the Zionist settlement, establishment of Israel, and the Palestinians. Yeah.
I mean, one interesting aspect, and that is part of real history. I mean, they decided, first of all, to introduce death penalty in Israel that did not exist before in order to execute Eichmann. And the public ritual was that Israel is doing that on behalf of the Jewish people, which was a way to demonstrate Jewish sovereignty as a nation. We can do that.
They also changed the law.
So they had to do a lot of things to do that. I mean, not only to take Eichmann from South America, they had to change the law, they had to find a place where to stage that trial, and they found a theater properly, a proper place, something Hannah Arendt commented on in her book. Yeah. And Susan Sontag also wrote an interesting piece about the Eichmann trial, where she wrote about the drama aspect of it and the disappointment from her perspective of the Eichmann trial as a drama, because she said in a courtroom drama we need suspense. There was no suspense in the Eichmann trial because we knew how it would end. So there was this public staging aspect, and then there was this disposal of him. I mean, first of all, they had to find a kind of crematorium in a land where cremating is forbidden. I mean, so the next
there are
problem,
multiple versions about where the crematorium came from.
Yeah, so they had to find a solution for that final act, or the pre-final act, and then they did not want to have his ashes buried on the grounds of Israel as a kind of probably something they felt completely as a desecration of the Holy Land or whatever, the ground. So they had to bring him outside even of the maritime territory, so outside of the line that defined the maritime territory of Israel, and to dispose him in the night, because that was something that was not staged for a public. It was a kind of ritual of unmaking him.
Yes.
And so there was even a kind of magic ritual about it to do that.
Also under the excuses of like a top secrecy, from fears that there will be people who would like to abolish this or do something against it.
Yeah, and they also probably there's a good reason. I mean, they didn't want to have a place where, I don't know, Nazis would come to celebrate him, but probably that's not exactly what would happen in Israel as much, but maybe today, because now we have Russian neo-Nazis in Israel as well. But the interesting thing about that is that this magic ritual of finally winning that war was so fitting in that particular situation in the early 60s, where they wanted to celebrate becoming a nation that is able to judge over the perpetrators who did this to the Jewish people. So they really wanted to, it was a kind of a second creation of the nation in a way. Yeah. With a side in the light and a side in the dark.
And I was asked a few times when I showed this film if I'm, through showing it, I'm not, in a way, donating to the memory of Eichmann, this idea that to get rid of any image, any object that can memorialize the perpetrator. So I had to think about it, and I realized that, and of course, Eichmann is everything but disappeared from the memory, although we don't have this object.
Even the glass cage is exhibited in a museum in Israel.
Yes, but as opposed to that, I realized that growing up in Jerusalem, where you see everywhere remnants of Palestinian village that were destroyed in 1947-8, and you grew up knowing nothing about it, and you grew up in some kind of like absence in your memory, although you have very distinctive objects that are existing there. So really this kind of memory doesn't have to do much with the object itself. It has much more to do with the national indoctrination and what the regime wants you to remember.
I would like to add to this moment of 1961 two comments. The one is with regard to Rothberg's book, because I think that the year of 1961 is key with regard to the way how Jean Rouge and Edgar Morin's Chronicle of a Summer, Chronik eines Sommers, is trying to refer to October 17 in 1961, the Algerian uprising, and on the other hand, the way how Eichmann at the same time comes into play, and that is a perfect example for Rothberg to speak about multidirectional memory that becomes issue in the film. And on the other hand, I right now think also about Omri Böhm's book, Israel, Utopia, in which he says that the Eichmann trial was significant for the way how Israel constituted itself via the Shoah perspective, and that it became a European construct, and that it became constitutive for the self-understanding of Israel that was then in 1961. And whereas Michael Rothberg then argues for a multi-perspective memory, Omri Böhm claims that we need to forget to remember in order to try to overcome identificatory memory. So that is somehow a question to you or to you, how you would relate these two perspectives, the one by Michael Rothberg, the other by Omri Böhm, because in a way they share a similar perspective on the year of 1961, and on the other hand they differ in the way how they would conceive memory as a starting point.
And there is an earlier article that was just published in Haaretz I think it was in the 80s by Yehuda Shenav, I think, and he writes about in the, how do you say it in English, in the right of forgetfulness, or where there's obviously a kind of fetishization of the memory culture by the state of Israel over the Holocaust, and we see it mostly, and the most poignant picture of it is the high school visits to the concentration camps, wearing the Israeli flag on their back and so on, and he argued that how can you, in a way, kind of like how can you move on as a society where children from such early age are indoctrinated to this kind of memory, where they have nothing to, as an inability to digest it or to work through it. There's a kind of an inability for that. So I don't know if the two are clashing each other, but yes.
I mean, there is one answer to Omri, and I mean, he knows that himself. The harder you try to forget, the more you remember. But because this is a kind of a contradiction in itself. Mm-hmm. But what we see today is more and more a memory that is replaced by an ideology of memory and a kind of prefabricated ritual of memory that is something very different from memory, at least in the end. And I think there's one thing that is to say about this debate today about multidirectional memory, because there are two very different ways to discuss the subject. And the puzzling way you do it in this very ambiguous construction of the Nazi idea of a white city as an Arab village, and the self-reflection of Rupin, who indeed for a while advocated attempts of creating some kind of agreement with the local Arab population, and then started later to develop ideas of transfer, to use that very facade word for expulsion. But I think what is clear from how Michael Rothberg develops the subject is that it's not about talk. It's not a talk about simply interpreting different kinds of mass violence as something coming from the same source, as we now have it in the debate about Dirk Moses, where you sometimes really have the idea that he tries to find the super explanation for all kinds of mass violence and genocide, etc. But to understand that one kind of violence can influence another kind of violence, and that these kind of histories are entangled. They're not the same. It's not a discussion about comparing the Holocaust with the Nakba or whatever, but it's the necessity to understand that these kind of historical developments have an influence on each other. And what we today see is, in the public discussion, the use of history to delegitimize the aspirations of the other. So what we see is that the Palestinian aspirations in the public debate is delegitimized by calling their aspirations as a part of anti-Semitism. And on the other side, you have attempts to delegitimize Jewish aspirations by simply trying to put them into a history of colonialism in a very simplistic way sometimes, which is also understandable as an attempt to delegitimize the point of the other, instead of trying to understand how things are related to each other and entangled.
Yes. And through this image of the postcard, I was trying to touch as the very final. I will maybe show the final shot of the film itself, which would probably would be the best way. Sorry about that. I'll just open again the White City to show the very last. This very last image, which tries to take the exact point of view of the original postcard, of the postcard that was later tried to doctored by the Nazis, and give it kind of like another twist or more twists, where this kind of portrayal of an Arab city is becoming a scene of the Nakba, where the Arab population is being put on military trucks, being drove out, and in a way we are from this image of the Nazi portrayal of this white city, we are going back to the original white city, which is in a way kind of clean and empty, but also trying to say something, and this is something we talked about the type of Islamophobia in Germany, where suddenly this is filmed in Stuttgart, this kind of like Arab people, many Arab people in Germany, and the Islamophobia and the paranoia that this and the hate that this created. So in a way, this and you mentioned this Denkbilder, these poignant images that contain everything. So in a way, I try to put all this in this one complex image. Also important to say that these images of modernist architecture and camels existed in reality in Palestine in the 30s, where Tel Aviv was already half built. There's an image here with modernist buildings, but camels were still used as working animal. Yes. We can.
Maybe the crazy thing is that for the Nazis, this kind of architecture was Oriental, and in Israel, it's considered the very European architecture.
Yes.
But it's interesting that you refer this scene in the end to Germany. Not to be misunderstood, no? Because there is a German Central European idea of getting rid of those Arabs today, which is really informing the whole debate about Israel. I mean, it's giving the energy, because I don't think that the Germans and the Austrians are really discussing Israel at the moment. They discuss their ideas about the future of Europe.
Especially because the ideas in the debate have little to do with the reality in Israel and Palestine, but it is definitely debates that are being pushed through a society that is becoming an immigration society with different people, with different traumas and different histories are coming in, and you can no longer have the same narrative. It's being challenging it. Would you like to? Yeah, let's read another text.
So many possibilities to contribute with quotes from your book. So I have to choose one.
You still should read the book.
I think I go for Bashir and Amos Goldberg, Deliberating the Holocaust and the Nakba, Disruptive Empathy and Binationalism in Israel-Palestine. Thus, even if the Holocaust and the Nakba are incomparable events of different magnitude, in other senses, they structurally and albeit partially share the same type of dangerous political rationale, together with many other historical phenomena. We underscore the partially, since neither the Holocaust nor the Nakba, nor the other events to which we have alluded, can be entirely reduced to this political logic alone. Yet, this historical and political context, however unsatisfactory, is certainly important and essential to understanding these events. The refugee is therefore a major political and cultural figure who, despite all the difference, links the Jewish Holocaust to the Palestinian Nakba and stands as a figure of radical critique of the exclusionary ethnic model of the nation state.
Which is, of course, the refugee also goes beyond, goes from Hannah Arendt's text about Jewish refugees all the way to Germany today,
yes.
Bringing refugees in and then realizing that, people are coming with their historical baggages and political affiliations, and not only. You have to.
They're not just naked. Even if they seem naked, they have a baggage.
Yes.
We already have 10 to 8, and we should open to the audience, I think.
I just wanted to suggest that we can open this door for questions and discussion. So, first of all, thank you very much for this.
can say slow science or slow science discussion, and it's not just a kind of multi-directed memory, but also a kind of multi-layered complexity of meanings and possible readings of your films, Dani.
Excuse me?
Thank you. I just say thank you. And I just stress that you have many layers in your film, and we just touched upon a couple of them, but not all of them. So we haven't discussed yet the visual language of the film and many other aspects. But now the floor is yours. Comments and questions are welcome. So yes, please.
Yeah, yes, sure. I'm Ekaterina Degod, director of Historisch Herbst Festival in Graz. And hello, everybody, and Alexander as well. So we finally meet in person. So I have a question. I have many, but this may be the first question to Dani. So you have been working on this project for many years, and I assume one of the reasons you are doing it is to say something which is still not got right somehow in this whole entanglement. It's not really understood, right? And do you feel that the situation changed also for you? How did it evolve for you? Because now, how did it start for you? And do you feel that you are surrounded by a different situation in this context now or not? I feel yes, somehow, because this notion of nation state and nationalism in general is somehow legitimized in my feeling, not just on the right, but also on the left, unfortunately, and we are all kind of are supposed to check our blood, so this notion of blood roots of each of us, which we can explore through some commercial, firmas. Do you feel that this is, what was the involvement for you for this, how you did your project from 10 years ago to now?
To be honest, the first film started relatively, in comparison to now, relatively in a naive way. It was like being haunted by the story of this police taking a boat at night with those ashes. And of course, it's a very important vehicle of art making, where you actually kind of act on your own experiences from the past and not only on your concept. It's something that you grow up in and you come to process, and this film is a process, and then starting to understand what happened, looking at what I did as the film, and starting to understand what happens, and slowly it is evolving. There were other art projects that I did in between, and there was a time like around 2014 and especially around summers 2014 and the heavy attack on Gaza and all this. There were other projects in this year that were dealing very much with the Nakba and about this memory. So it is evolving for me in a way that is, of course, less and less nationalistic, and then being exposed later on to Michael Rothberg concept and other concept that I'm referring to here. So it is something that, and of course, yes, you are right, that from this point through what happened in the world, and we had 2016 until now and so on, so many things change and I guess you suggested the other direction, in a more nationalist. What we see today, especially over the newspapers in Germany and beyond, is a very fierce debate that is one what we mentioned about especially. I know less about Austria here, but Germany definitely is becoming a immigration country, and the changes, generational change, and our undercurrent of the decolonial discussion that is always getting stuck because of the situation in Israel. It's always like the point where it becomes a violent discussion and not only an historical discussion.
I mean, I think there is a kind of Ungleichzeitigkeit, I have no idea how to translate it into English. Asynchronity between two phenomenons, crises, or however you would call it, that are verstärken, mein Gott, enforce each other. One is that today, particularly in Germany, something is realized, and that is that a multidirectional memory is reality. In the way that, I mean, up to the big number of refugees from the Middle East coming into Germany, it was mainly, even if there was already a lot of anti-Muslim resentment and demagogy and propaganda, it was mostly a talk about the Turkish people. And that was not yet bringing the Middle East conflict really into the German society the way you simply have it in form of people who have other memories and another perspective.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about this. And also based on what Rothberg suggests, the multidirectional memory always exists between people, and this is the difference between listening to the national narrative, the imposed narrative, rather than the...
On the ground, it is multidirectional.
Yes.
And you have this wave of national populism all over Europe that is, I mean, simply not to be overseen. On the other hand, in Israel and Palestine, you have a bit of opposite phenomenon, because in a way, as long as people were just simply always talking about the two-state solution, a kind of ethno-nationalist solution for the conflict was taken for granted, even by people from the left. I mean, like Amos Oz, you name it, everybody was talking about a two-state solution, which did not mean anything else, but on the basis of ethno-nationalism, we tried to solve the conflict. Everybody who is able to think for a minute today knows that this solution is gone. It's not existing. I mean, some people still pretend that there is something like that, but everybody who knows the situation on the ground knows there is no two-state solution. We don't know yet what will be another way of thinking, but there are people trying to do that, like Bashir, from a Palestinian perspective, and others. And this is new territory of thinking. I mean, forced by simply the facts on the ground. But this also causes panic among a lot of people. I mean, as long as you could say in the future we will have the two-state solution, we could always say, okay, we have problems today, it's not nice, there's violence, there's injustice, but there will be a bright future as soon as we can divide the territory in two. Everybody knows that's not possible. And it causes simply a panic among a lot of people. Because their whole mindset is falling into pieces.
Yeah, I was asked by a German person a few weeks ago if I'm for two states or one state solution. And first of all, I find it funny that someone, as if I'm like, if it's to me to decide like
solve it.
Second, I told him it's a kind of like a relief because it is a one state. It's just that there's a huge part of it is under occupation and under set of laws, and millions of people living without rights. Yes, Sabet, you wanted to add something?
In this context, the suggestion by Omri Böhm, I already mentioned, he speaks about a one-state solution by giving up Jewish sovereignty, as the single, fundament of constitution, but he's saying forget the two-state solution. There's only possible but impossible utopia it is that it becomes a kind of binational or trinational constitution. So, and I thought that was is a thought-provoking model, but he says other options are not thinkable, because how would you, move millions of people from one place to the other? It's impossible. So I don't know how you think about this.
Unfortunately, it's
suggestion.
possible, but it's extremely violent.
Omri says it's possible. The only question is, do we want that?
It is, it is violent.
And can we survive that?
Yes.
As human beings.
But I don't know whether I understood you correctly, Hanno, whether you were saying that through the immigration, through migrancy, it is now that we have multidirectional positions towards the Middle East conflict. But I think about the way how the question of Palestine is for a long time so central for the German lefties, like, you know about, of course, Munich in 72.
This was projections of a privileged people that were talking about liberation and this and that. Now it's here. It's not talking about something that is distant. It's taking serious the perspective, the worldview, the being of people who are becoming or are already part of this society. This is something that fundamentally changed.
At the same time, has very little to do with the reality over there. If one goes there and understands how people live there, and it has the discussion in the over the German press and so on, it has very little to do. It's in a way a projection fantasy. Again, we're going back to these fantasy images about which had not much to do with over there. It has much to do with the psyche of the German people and the guilt complex and
this is also true, unfortunately, for the German left, who is also a kind of fantasy of Israel and Palestine that is not exactly matching.
I think it's always, for me, a little bit difficult to speak about the German guilt complex, of course, but it has been used by the right wing, So I would be really very careful to speak about that, because it is how you, in which context you put that. And I think, it took a long time in Germany. We think there's already this ritual, like Dirk Moses is saying. I would oppose that. I would say it took really a long time until the 1980s. And if I also think about how important the contributions by artists was to bring in certain concepts of memory, like the Topographie des Terrors, that was an initiative by artists. So it is not so self-evident as it sounds in the polemics against a certain culture of memory. I, in a certain sense, would also defend, because that is, I think it's a tricky, the function, the ideological function, but at the same time, it is something people really fought for. Yeah,
but right now we are in a place where you mentioned artists' contribution, these artists who are continuing to try to contribute, and I do think that artists' role is to continue imagine different possibilities, talk about the past in a different way, do things that the politicians obviously don't do, being attacked heavily in Germany and by right and left, and it creates a pretty scary situation where people are self-censoring, obviously, and being censored effectively. Yeah.
I'm in the middle of an email discussion with Dirk Moses at the moment about his pretension of inventing the critical perspective toward the German guilt complex, etc. And I mean, maybe Australia is really so far away from Germany that he didn't realize that since the 1990s, there's an ongoing debate about all these questions that he completely neglected in his argument, which I found pretty crazy.
Unfortunately, Dirk Moses is not here, so I think it would be better to discuss his book when he will be here. We should slowly close the open part.
Is there anything else, Katerina, if you want to reflect on it? Or?
No, I'm glad that it opened some discussions.
Yeah, thank you for this.
Very important for me.
Yeah. Anyone else? Okay.
Everybody's hungry. Wants to buy
No,
the
we
book.
can continue the discussion in another form. So we have some wine and sandwiches. So now we will close the open part of the discussion. Thank you very much for coming,
Thank you.
for all of you and the audience. And yeah, and we can just continue the discussion here in this part of the bookshop. So thank you again.
Thank you.